used to believe that love was enough to silence the critics. I thought that when you found someone who made you laugh until your stomach hurt, who held your hand through every storm, and who looked at you like you were the only person in the room, nothing else mattered. For 3 years of marriage, I held on to that belief like a lifeline. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. But sitting across from my father at Sunday dinner, watching his disapproving stare burn holes through my husband David, I wondered if maybe I'd been naive. "Ashley, honey, when are you going to face reality?" Dad's voice cut through the clatter of silverware against Mom's good china. "You're 28 years old, living in that cramped apartment downtown, while David bounces from one dead-end job to another. This isn't the life I raised you for." I felt David's hand tighten around mine under the table, his jaw clenching in that way it always did when Dad started in on us. 3 years of this. 3 years of my father, Robert Harrison, successful owner of Harrison Construction, making it crystal clear that he thought his daughter had married beneath her station. "Dad, please. Not today." I kept my voice steady, though my heart was racing. David's been working hard at the community center. He's making a difference. Dad scoffed, setting down his fork with more force than necessary. "A difference? Ashley, he's a glorified babysitter making $12 an hour." Meanwhile, the Peterson boy just made partner at his law firm, and the Williams kid is opening his second dental practice. He leaned back in his chair, shaking his head. "I had such high hopes for you. Valedictorian, full scholarship to State University, degree in business administration. And this is what you do with it?" The familiar sting of his words hit me like they always did. I glanced at my mother, hoping for support, but she just stirred her mashed potatoes, avoiding eye contact. She'd given up trying to mediate these conversations months ago. "Mr. Harrison," David finally spoke, his voice calm but strained. "I understand your concerns, but I love your daughter. I provide for her the best I can, and we're happy." "Happy?" Dad's laugh was bitter. "Happy doesn't pay for decent health care. Happy doesn't buy a house in a safe neighborhood. Happy doesn't secure a future for grandchildren." His eyes locked on mine. "Ashley, you could have had anyone. Remember Tommy Rodriguez from college? He's running his family's restaurant chain now. Or what about Marcus Chen? He invited you to that charity gala last Christmas." "Because I was already married, Dad." The words came out sharper than I intended, and I didn't want anyone else. I wanted David. The silence that followed was deafening. My younger sister Emma, home from her sophomore year at college, cleared her throat awkwardly. "So, who wants dessert? Mom made that apple pie everyone loves." But Dad wasn't finished. He turned to David with that look I'd seen him give contractors who'd disappointed him. "Son, I'm going to be frank with you. You seem like a decent enough guy, but decent doesn't cut it in the real world. My daughter deserves better than scraping by month to month. She deserves security, stability, a man who can take care of her properly." "I do take care of her," David said quietly, but I could see the hurt in his eyes. "Do you?" Dad pulled out his phone, scrolling through something. "Because according to Emma, you two couldn't even afford to fix your car last month. Ashley had to ask her sister for money just to get the transmission repaired." My cheeks burned with embarrassment. I shot a look at Emma, who winced apologetically. "She'd promised not to tell anyone about the loan." "That's temporary," David said, his voice tighter now. "Everyone goes through rough patches." "For 3 years?" Dad's eyebrows rose. "Son, when I was your age, I was already building my first house. By 30, I owned my own company." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. I made sure my family never had to worry about money, never had to choose between paying rent and fixing the car. He gestured around the dining room of their comfortable suburban home. "This is what a man provides for his family." I felt tears prick at my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. "Not here. Not in front of him." David provides plenty, I said through gritted teeth. He provides love, support, laughter. He volunteers at the community center because he wants to help kids who don't have anyone else. That matters. It's admirable, Dad conceded with a patronizing smile. But admirable doesn't put food on the table. And it certainly doesn't justify my daughter living paycheck to paycheck when she could have done so much better. The rest of dinner passed in uncomfortable silence. David barely touched his food, and I could feel the tension radiating from him like heat from a furnace. When we finally escaped to our 10-year-old Honda Civic, I turned to him immediately. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry he said all that." David gripped the steering wheel, staring straight ahead. "He's not wrong, you know." "What?" I twisted in my seat to face him. "Don't you dare say that." "Ashley, look at us. Look at where we live, what we drive, what we can afford." His voice was heavy with something I'd never heard before. Defeat. Maybe your dad has a point. Maybe you did marry down. "Stop it." I reached for his hand, but he pulled away to start the engine. "David, stop it right now. I married the man I love. I married someone who makes me laugh every single day, who holds me when I cry, who believes in making the world better even when it doesn't pay well. I married someone who sees the best in everyone, including troubled kids that everyone else has given up on." He was quiet for a long moment as we pulled out of my parents' driveway. Finally, he said, "I just hate that he makes you defend me. I hate that your family thinks you settled. I don't care what they think. But you should care. And deep down, you do." He glanced at me briefly before turning his attention back to the road. "I see it in your eyes sometimes, Ashley. When we're grocery shopping and you put something back because it's too expensive. When your friends post pictures of their vacations and new houses on social media. When Emma talks about her spring break plans that cost more than we make in a month." I wanted to deny it, to tell him he was wrong, but the words stuck in my throat. Because there was a grain of truth in what he said. Not about regretting marrying him, never that, but about the small moments of disappointment that crept in despite my best efforts. Like when my college roommate bought her first house while we were still renting our cramped one-bedroom apartment. Or when Emma casually mentioned spending $300 on a single outfit while I was wearing the same dress I'd had since our wedding. "I love our life," I said finally, and I meant it. "I love you. That's what matters." David nodded, but I could tell he wasn't entirely convinced. The drive home was quiet, both of us lost in our own thoughts. Our apartment was exactly what Dad had described. Cramped. The living room, kitchen, and dining area were essentially one space, with our bedroom and a tiny bathroom down a narrow hallway. The walls were thin enough that we could hear our neighbor's television through the shared wall, and the radiator clanked loudly whenever the heat kicked on. But it was ours, and I'd spent months making it feel like home with thrift store finds and plants that somehow thrived despite the limited natural light. David went straight to the kitchen and started washing the dishes we'd left in the sink that morning. It was something he did when he was upset, cleaned obsessively as if he could scrub away whatever was bothering him. "Want to talk about it?" I asked, settling onto our secondhand couch. "What's to talk about?" He didn't turn around. "Your dad thinks I'm a loser, and maybe he's right. He doesn't think you're a loser, he just..." I struggled to find the right words. "He measures success differently than we do." "No, Ashley, he measures success the way the world does. Money, status, security. And by those standards, I'm failing you." I watched him scrub the same plate for the third time, his shoulders tense with frustration. David had always been sensitive about money, even before we got married. He'd grown up in foster care after his parents died in a car accident when he was 8. He'd bounced from family to family until he aged out of the system at 18, putting himself through community college while working 2 jobs. The fact that he'd made it as far as he had was nothing short of miraculous, but try telling my father that. "Remember when we first met?" I said softly. "You were volunteering at that literacy program downtown, and I was there doing community service for my business ethics class." A small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "You were terrible at reading to kids." "I was not terrible, I was dramatic." "There's a difference." I grinned, remembering how I'd acted out every voice in the picture books, making the kids giggle uncontrollably. You told me I should consider a career in theater instead of business. I also told you that you had the most beautiful laugh I'd ever heard. He finally turned around, leaning against the counter. And that you were way out of my league. Still am, I teased, but my heart ached, seeing the sadness in his eyes. Are you, though? His question was serious now. Because sometimes I wonder if I'm holding you back. If you'd be happier with someone who could give you the life your dad wants for you. I stood up and crossed to him, taking his face in my hands. David Michael Chen, you listen to me. I didn't fall in love with your bank account. I fell in love with the man who spent his Saturday mornings reading to kids who reminded him of himself. I fell in love with the guy who brought me soup when I had the flu, even though you had to walk 6 blocks in the snow because your car wouldn't start. I fell in love with someone who sees the good in everyone, even my impossible father. He leaned into my touch, closing his eyes. I just want to be enough for you. You are enough. You're more than enough. You're everything. We held each other in our tiny kitchen, surrounded by mismatched furniture and peeling linoleum, and for a moment I believed my own words completely. Love was enough. It had to be. But late that night, lying in bed listening to David's steady breathing beside me, I couldn't shake my father's words. I thought about my college friends who were buying houses and taking European vacations. I thought about Emma, who was 20 and somehow had more spending money than we did. I thought about the future. What if we wanted kids? How would we afford childcare on David's salary? What if one of us got sick? Our insurance barely covered routine checkups, let alone anything serious. I loved David desperately, completely, but love didn't pay the bills. And despite what I'd told him, there were moments, like when I'd had to ask Emma for money, or when I'd declined yet another dinner invitation because we couldn't afford to eat out, when I wondered if Dad might be right about one thing. Maybe I could have chosen an easier path. The next morning brought new challenges. David left early for his job at the Riverside Community Center, where he coordinated after-school programs for at-risk kids. The pay was terrible, but he loved it, and the kids adored him. I headed to my job at Morrison Marketing, a small firm where I handled social media accounts for local businesses. It wasn't exactly the corporate career I'd envisioned with my business degree, but it paid better than David's job and had decent benefits. My phone buzzed during my lunch break. A text from Emma. Dad's still ranting about Sunday dinner. He found some article about your college friend Sarah getting promoted to VP at her company. Sorry. I sighed, knowing I'd probably hear about Sarah's success at the next family gathering. Dad had a way of keeping track of my former classmates' achievements, as if their successes were proof of my failures. Another text came through, this one from David. One of the kids gave me a drawing today. It's you and me as superheroes. Want to see? Despite everything, I smiled. This was what Dad didn't understand. David's work might not pay much, but it mattered. He was changing lives every day, giving kids hope and guidance that might be the difference between them ending up in college or on the streets. How could you put a price on that? That evening, I stopped by the community center to pick up David. The building was old and needed repairs, but it buzzed with activity. Kids of all ages filled the main room, some doing homework, others playing games, all of them gravitating toward David like he was a magnet. Mrs. Chen! A girl named Maria, maybe 10 years old, ran up to me with a huge grin. Did you see the picture I drew for Mr. David? Not yet, but I hear it's amazing. It's you guys as superheroes. Mr. David said you fight bad guys with kindness. I laughed, watching David help a teenager with his math homework across the room. Something like that. Mr. David's the best, Maria continued, her expression turning serious. He helped my mom fill out papers for my school when she couldn't read them good, and he bought me new shoes when mine had holes. My heart clenched. David had bought this child's shoes? On our already tight budget? As if sensing my thoughts, David appeared beside us. Ready to go home? I nodded, but my mind was reeling. On the walk to the car, I asked, David, did you buy Maria's shoes? He was quiet for a moment. Her old ones were falling apart. She was embarrassed to come to the center. How much did they cost? Ashley? How much? $60. He stopped walking and turned to face me. I know we don't have extra money, but I couldn't watch her suffer. I used the money I'd been saving for your birthday present. I felt tears spring to my eyes. Here was my husband, working for barely above minimum wage, spending his own savings on a child who needed shoes. And my father thought he wasn't good enough? I love you, I whispered, throwing my arms around him right there on the sidewalk. Even though I'm financially irresponsible? Especially because you're financially irresponsible in the most beautiful way possible. But that night, as I balanced our checkbook and moved money around to cover rent, utilities, and groceries, I couldn't ignore the knot of anxiety in my stomach. We were living paycheck to paycheck, and David's generous heart, while one of the things I loved most about him, wasn't helping our financial situation. The breaking point came 2 weeks later. I was at work when my phone rang. David, calling from the emergency room. Don't panic, he said immediately, but I'm at St. Mary's. I'm okay, but I need you to come down here. My heart stopped. What happened? I was breaking up a fight between two of the older kids, and I caught an elbow to the ribs. They want to do some x-rays to make sure nothing's broken. I was out the door before he finished explaining, my hands shaking as I drove to the hospital. The emergency room was crowded and chaotic, and it took me 20 minutes to find David in one of the curtained areas, looking pale but alert. The doctor says it's just bruised ribs, he assured me as I rushed to his side. But they want to keep me for observation for a few hours. Thank God you're okay. I collapsed into the plastic chair beside his bed, my adrenaline finally starting to ebb. What were they fighting about? Jake thought Marcus was hitting on his girlfriend. Typical teenage drama. David winced as he tried to sit up straighter. I should have handled it better. You should have let them handle it themselves instead of jumping into the middle of it, I said, but there was no real anger in my voice. Of course David had intervened. He couldn't stand to see anyone hurting. Mrs. Chen? A nurse appeared in the doorway. I need to talk to you about insurance and billing. My stomach dropped. Our insurance was basic at best, and emergency room visits were expensive. I followed her to a small office where she explained that our portion of the bill would be nearly $2,000. $2,000 we didn't have, $2,000 that would max out our credit card and leave us unable to pay rent next month. I called in sick the next day and spent hours on the phone with the hospital's billing department, trying to work out a payment plan. By the time David came home from work, against my protests that he should take a few days off, I was exhausted and defeated. How bad is it? He asked, seeing my expression. Bad. Even with a payment plan, we're looking at $200 a month for the next 10 months. And that's if nothing else goes wrong. David sank onto the couch beside me, holding his ribs. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, Ashley. It's not your fault. You were doing your job. My job that barely pays anything, and now can't even keep us out of debt. His voice was bitter. Your dad was right. You married down, and now look where it's gotten you. I wanted to argue, to tell him again that money didn't matter, but I was tired. Tired of worrying about bills. Tired of defending our choices. Tired of pretending that love was enough when the world seemed determined to prove otherwise. That night I lay awake doing math in my head. Even if I asked for a raise, even if David took on weekend work, we were barely keeping our heads above water. And what if something else happened? What if the car broke down again, or we had another medical emergency? For the first time since we'd gotten married, I allowed myself to imagine a different life. What if I had said yes when Marcus Chen, no relation to David despite the shared last name, had asked me out in college? He was a successful architect now, according to his social media posts. Or, what if I'd given Tommy Rodriguez a real chance? His family's restaurant empire was thriving, and he'd always been sweet to me. I felt guilty for even thinking about it, but I couldn't stop the thoughts from coming. What would it be like to not worry about money? To be able to buy groceries without calculating every purchase? To think about having children without panic about how we'd afford them? Beside me, David shifted in his sleep, unconsciously reaching for me even while dreaming. I looked at his face, peaceful and trusting, and felt my heart break a little. He loved me so completely, so unselfishly, and here I was questioning everything because of money. But as I finally drifted off to sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had to change. We couldn't keep living like this, always one emergency away from disaster. And despite all my protests to my father, I was starting to wonder if maybe, just maybe, he had a point. The next few weeks passed in a blur of tight budgets and tighter smiles. David threw himself into his work at the community center, staying late and taking on extra responsibilities that didn't come with extra pay. I picked up freelance social media work in the evenings, squinting at my laptop screen until my eyes burned. We barely saw each other, and when we did, we were both too exhausted to do more than exchange basic information about our days. The easy laughter that had once filled our apartment was replaced by the sound of clicking keyboards and the rustle of bills being shuffled from pile to pile. It was during one of these lonely evenings, David working late again and me struggling through a particularly difficult client project, that my phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but something made me answer. "Ashley, this is Margaret Whitfield. I suppose I'm your mother-in-law." I nearly dropped the phone. David had never mentioned a Margaret Whitfield, and I'd been under the impression that he had no family left. "I'm sorry, I think you have the wrong number," I said carefully. "You're married to David Chen, aren't you? David Michael Chen, born March 15, 1994? "Yes, but..." I was completely confused. David doesn't have any family. His parents died when he was 8, and he grew up in foster care. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then Margaret's voice, softer now. "Oh, my dear child, there's so much you don't know." My hands trembled as I gripped the phone tighter. "What do you mean there's so much I don't know? Who are you exactly?" Margaret's voice carried a warmth that somehow made me trust her immediately. "I'm David's grandmother, sweetheart. His father's mother. And before you ask why David doesn't know about me, it's because I've been searching for him for over 15 years. I sank into our threadbare armchair, my mind spinning. That's impossible. David told me his parents died in a car accident when he was 8, and that he had no other family. He went into foster care because there was nobody else. That's what they told him, yes, but it wasn't true." Margaret's voice cracked slightly. "My son Robert and his wife Linda did die in that accident, but I was very much alive. I was in Europe when it happened, taking care of my own dying mother. By the time I returned to the States 3 months later, David had vanished into the system." Vanished? How does a child just vanish? Bureaucracy, miscommunication, and what I later discovered was outright negligence. Margaret said bitterly. "The social worker assigned to David's case had apparently tried to contact me using an old address. When those letters came back undelivered, they assumed I either didn't exist or didn't want him. They placed him in emergency foster care, and somehow, his file got shuffled between departments until even they lost track of where he'd been placed. I felt sick to my stomach. You've been looking for him all this time? Every single day for 15 years. I hired private investigators, worked with social services, even put ads in newspapers across 3 states. David Chen is a common name, and without knowing which families he'd been placed with or if his name had been changed, it was like looking for a needle in a haystack." She paused, and I could hear her take a shaky breath. "I found him completely by accident 2 weeks ago." "How?" "I was visiting a friend who volunteers at various community centers around the city, doing reading programs for underprivileged children. She mentioned this wonderful young man named David Chen who coordinated programs at the Riverside Center, and something about the way she described him made me curious. She showed me a photo from one of their newsletters, and I knew immediately. He has his grandfather's eyes, my late husband's eyes." Tears were streaming down my face now. All these years, David had believed he was completely alone in the world, when his grandmother had been desperately searching for him. "Why are you calling me instead of him?" I asked. "Because I've learned to be careful. I've had my heart broken by false leads before, and I want to be absolutely certain before I turn his world upside down. I was hoping you could help me verify some details, and then maybe we could figure out the best way to approach him together." For the next hour, Margaret and I compared information. She knew details about David's early childhood that he'd shared with me over the years. His father's love of baseball, his mother's habit of singing while she cooked, the small scar on his forehead from falling off his bike when he was 6. But she also knew things he'd never told me. Things he probably didn't even remember. Like the fact that his middle name came from his great-grandfather, or that he'd had a beloved stuffed elephant named Dumbo that had been lost in the aftermath of the accident. "There's something else you should know," Margaret said as our conversation wound down. "Something that might explain why it's taken me so long to find him, and why this call might come as quite a shock to both of you." "What do you mean?" "My family, David's family, we're not poor, Ashley. When my husband died 10 years ago, he left me everything. And when my son Robert died, everything that would have been his passed to David. We're talking about a substantial inheritance that's been sitting in trust, waiting for him." My mouth went dry. "How substantial?" "The trust fund alone is worth approximately $12 million. But that's not including the real estate holdings, the investment portfolio, or the family business interests. David is, for all intents and purposes, one of the wealthiest young men in the state. He just doesn't know it yet." I couldn't speak. I literally could not form words. My husband who worked for $12 an hour and bought shoes for needy children with his birthday present money, was a multimillionaire. "Ashley? Are you still there?" "I'm here," I managed to whisper. This is a lot to process." "I understand completely. And I want you to know I'm not telling you this to overwhelm you or David. I'm telling you because I want him to have choices. I want him to be able to pursue his passion for helping children without worrying about money. I want him to be able to provide for his wife, for the family you might want to have someday." The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I'd been lying awake at night worrying about our finances, questioning whether love was enough, while David was actually wealthy beyond my wildest dreams. "How do we tell him?" I asked finally. "Very carefully," Margaret said. "This kind of news can be overwhelming. I was thinking perhaps we could meet first, the three of us, somewhere comfortable for him. I could bring documentation, photos, anything that might help him understand that this is real." We agreed to meet the following Saturday at a small cafe downtown, neutral territory where David might feel more at ease. Margaret would bring proof of their relationship and let David process the information at his own pace. After I hung up, I sat in our tiny living room for a long time, staring at the stack of unpaid bills on our coffee table. Everything I thought I knew about our life, about our struggles, about David's background, had just been turned upside down. When David came home that night, exhausted and smelling like the industrial cleaner they used at the community center, I almost blurted out everything. But something held me back. Maybe it was the way he immediately asked about my day, genuinely interested despite his own fatigue. Maybe it was how he heated up leftover soup for both of us, even though I knew he was probably starving. Or maybe it was the gentle way he rubbed my shoulders while I ate, commenting that I seemed tense. This was David. Kind, selfless, completely unaware that his life was about to change forever. And I realized that Margaret was right. This news needed to be delivered carefully, by someone who loved him. The rest of the week crawled by. I found myself looking at David differently, not because of the money, but because I kept thinking about that 8-year-old boy who'd lost everything and been failed by the very system meant to protect him. How different would his life have been if Margaret had found him then? Would he have grown up in private schools instead of foster homes? Would he have gone to an Ivy League university instead of community college? But then I'd watch him with the kids at the community center when I stopped by to pick him up, and I'd realize that maybe everything had happened exactly as it was supposed to. Maybe David needed to experience struggle and loss to become the man who could connect with these children, who could be a lifeline for kids who felt as abandoned as he once had. Friday night, David noticed my distraction. "You've been quiet all week," he said as we got ready for bed. "Is everything okay? Are you still worried about the medical bills?" "No, it's not that." I hesitated, then decided on a version of the truth. "Someone called me this week. Someone who thinks they might be related to you." David went very still. "Related to me how?" "She says she's your grandmother. Your father's mother." He sat down heavily on the edge of our bed. Ashley, that's impossible. If I had family, don't you think they would have found me when my parents died? Don't you think someone would have cared enough to keep me out of foster care? The pain in his voice broke my heart. She says she tried to find you. She says there were mistakes made, miscommunications. She's been looking for you for 15 years. 15 years? David's laugh was bitter. Right. If someone had been looking for me for 15 years, they would have found me. I've been working at the same community center for 3 years, Ashley. My name is on their website, their newsletters. I'm not exactly hiding. She found you through the community center, actually, through a friend who volunteers there. David was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. What does she want? To meet you. To explain everything. She has photos, documents, proof that you're related. And if she's telling the truth, if she really is my grandmother. His voice was carefully controlled, but I could hear the hope he was trying to suppress. Where has she been all my life? Why now? I think she should be the one to explain that. We're supposed to meet her tomorrow afternoon if you're willing. David lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling. I don't know if I can handle this, Ashley. I've spent 20 years accepting that I have no family. I've built my life around that reality. And now, just when everything is already falling apart financially, someone shows up claiming to be my grandmother? I curled up next to him, laying my head on his chest. What if it's real, though? What if you really do have family? Then I guess I'll have to figure out how to forgive them for letting me think I was alone for so long. The next morning, David was nervous in a way I'd never seen before. He changed clothes 3 times, asking me if he looked okay, if he looked respectable enough to meet a potential grandmother. It broke my heart that he was worried about making a good impression on family who should have been there for him all along. We arrived at the cafe early and chose a table near the back, away from the weekend crowd. David ordered coffee but didn't touch it, his leg bouncing under the table with nervous energy. What if this is some kind of scam? He asked for the 3rd time. What would be the point? We don't have anything worth scamming. Maybe she's confused. Maybe she thinks I'm someone else. David, breathe. If she's wrong, we'll figure that out quickly enough. And if she's right... I squeezed his hand. If she's right, then you finally get the family you've always deserved. At exactly 2 o'clock, an elegant woman in her 70s walked through the cafe door. She had silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and she was looking around the room with an expression of nervous anticipation. When her gaze landed on David, she stopped breathing. Even from across the room, I could see the family resemblance. They had the same strong jawline, the same expressive eyes, the same way of holding their shoulders when they were uncertain. Margaret walked over slowly, as if she were afraid sudden movements might make David disappear. When she reached our table, tears were streaming down her face. "Oh my God," she whispered. "You look exactly like your father did at your age." David stood up awkwardly, unsure of the protocol for meeting a grandmother he'd never known existed. Margaret solved the problem by pulling him into a fierce hug, holding him like she was afraid to let go. "I'm sorry," she said, stepping back and wiping her eyes. "I promised myself I wouldn't cry, but seeing you... I've dreamed about this moment for 15 years." For the next 2 hours, Margaret shared David's family history. She showed him photos of his parents from before he was born, pictures of family gatherings he was too young to remember, documentation that proved beyond any doubt that she was who she claimed to be. "Your father used to build elaborate blanket forts with you," she told him, showing him a picture of a grinning toddler peeking out from under a dining room table draped with sheets. "He said you were going to be an architect someday because you had such strong opinions about structural integrity." David stared at the photo with wonder. "I remember blanket forts. I always thought I'd made that memory up. And your mother would sing you to sleep every night. She had the most beautiful voice. You used to beg her to sing the same song over and over." Margaret hummed a few bars of a melody I didn't recognize, and David's eyes widened. "I know that song. I've hummed it my whole life, but I never knew where I learned it. She wrote it for you when you were born. She called it David's lullaby. By this point, all three of us were crying. The weight of 15 lost years hung heavy in the air, but there was also relief, joy, and the tentative beginning of healing. "I need you to know," Margaret said, reaching across the table to take David's hands. "I never stopped looking for you, not for a single day. I hired investigators, I worked with social services, I even had volunteers passing out flyers with your photo at community centers and schools across 3 states. Why didn't anyone tell me you were looking?" David asked, his voice raw with emotion. "Because the system failed you, sweetheart. Your case file got lost between departments." The social worker who was supposed to maintain contact with potential family members either didn't do her job or documented it so poorly that no one could follow up. By the time I was able to get lawyers involved, you'd been moved between so many foster homes that even the state couldn't tell me where you were. David absorbed this information quietly, and I could see him working through years of hurt and abandonment, trying to reconcile his lived experience with this new version of events. "I have something else to tell you," Margaret said gently. "Something about your inheritance." David looked confused. "My inheritance?" "When your parents died, everything they owned was supposed to go to you. But since you couldn't be located, it went into a trust fund. That money has been accumulating interest for 20 years, waiting for you to claim it." "How much money are we talking about?" David asked cautiously. Margaret took a deep breath. "The trust fund is currently worth about $12 million. But that's not including the real estate, the investment portfolio, or your father's share in the family textile business." The color drained from David's face. $12 million? Give or take a few $100,000, depending on market fluctuations. David looked at me, then back at Margaret, then at me again. "I don't understand. Are you saying I'm rich?" "David, honey, you're more than rich. You're wealthy. You could quit your job tomorrow and live comfortably for the rest of your life. You could start your own foundation, fund community centers across the country, send 1,000 kids to college. You could do anything you want." The silence that followed was deafening. David stared at the table, processing information that had just turned his entire worldview upside down. When he finally looked up, his first words weren't about the money. "Does this mean I can afford to take Ashley on a real honeymoon?" Margaret and I both burst into laughter despite our tears. Of course, that would be David's first thought. Not what the money could do for him, but what it could do for the people he loved. "Sweetheart," Margaret said with a gentle smile, "you could take Ashley on a honeymoon to every continent if you wanted to." David turned to me, his eyes still wide with shock. "Ashley, you realize what this means? It means you can finally tell my father exactly what you think of his opinions about you marrying down," I said, and for the first time in weeks, David's real smile, the one that had made me fall in love with him, lit up his entire face. But even as I joked, my mind was reeling. Our financial struggles were over. The medical bills, the rent payments, the constant anxiety about making ends meet, all of it was suddenly irrelevant. David could quit his job at the community center, though I suspected he wouldn't. He could afford to be generous with the kids he worked with, and more importantly, he could expand his impact exponentially. "There's one more thing," Margaret said, pulling out a small velvet box. "This was your mother's engagement ring. Your father wanted you to have it someday, for when you found someone special to spend your life with." She handed the box to David, who opened it with trembling fingers. Inside was a stunning vintage ring with a center diamond surrounded by smaller stones in an intricate Art Deco setting. It was exactly the kind of ring I'd admired in jewelry store windows, but never imagined owning. "It's beautiful," I breathed. "Ashley," David said suddenly, sliding out of his chair and onto one knee right there in the middle of the cafe. Other patrons were starting to stare, but he didn't seem to notice. "I know we're already married, but I want to do this right. I want to give you the proposal you deserved, with a ring that means something in front of family." He took my simple gold wedding band off my finger and replaced it with his mother's ring. It fit perfectly. "Ashley Marie Harrison Chen, you married me when I had nothing to offer but love, You defended me when your family questioned your choice. You've stood by me through every struggle and believed in me when I couldn't believe in myself. Will you stay married to me now that I can finally give you everything you deserve?" Through my tears, I managed to whisper, "Yes, you ridiculous man." Yes, of course, yes. The entire cafe erupted in applause as David slipped the ring onto my finger and kissed me like we were newlyweds again. And, in a way, I suppose we were. That evening, as we drove home in our beat-up Honda Civic, I couldn't stop staring at the ring on my finger. It caught the light from passing street lamps, throwing tiny rainbows across the car's interior. "This doesn't feel real," David said quietly. "This morning I was a broke community center worker with medical bills we couldn't afford. Tonight I'm someone who could buy the entire community center if I wanted to." "Are you going to?" I asked. "Buy the community center, I mean?" He was quiet for a moment, considering. "Maybe. Or maybe I'll build a new one. A better one. With state-of-the-art facilities and programs that could really make a difference." "Your grandmother was right, you know. You could fund community centers across the country. The Chen Foundation," he said thoughtfully, "has a nice ring to it." We pulled into the parking lot of our apartment complex, looking up at the building that had felt so cramped just hours before. Now it seemed quaint, like a place we'd remember fondly someday as where our real life together began. "David?" I said as we climbed the stairs to our second-floor apartment. "Yeah?" "Tomorrow, when we call my father to tell him about Margaret and the inheritance." "Yeah?" I grinned wickedly. "Can I be the one to deliver the news about your trust fund?" David threw back his head and laughed, the sound echoing through the stairwell. "Ashley Chen, I think I'm going to enjoy being rich with you." As we unlocked our apartment door, stepping into the tiny space that had housed so many worries and struggles, I realized that Margaret had given us more than just money. She'd given David back his history, his family, his sense of belonging in the world. And she'd given both of us the freedom to build whatever life we wanted together. The stack of bills still sat on our coffee table, but they no longer held any power over us. Tomorrow, we'd start figuring out how to manage sudden wealth responsibly. We'd meet with financial advisors and lawyers and probably Margaret's accountant. We'd make plans for the foundation David was already dreaming about. But tonight we were just David and Ashley Chen, married and in love, and finally free to imagine a future without limits. And somewhere across town, my father was about to get the surprise of his life. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the look on my father's face when he'd lectured David about providing properly for his family. The irony was so thick I could practically taste it. My husband, the man Dad had dismissed as a glorified babysitter, was worth more money than my father would see in 10 lifetimes. David, surprisingly, slept like a baby. I suppose after years of carrying the weight of financial stress and family rejection, learning that both problems had just evaporated was better than any sleeping pill. I watched him in the early morning light, filtering through our thin curtains, his face peaceful in a way I hadn't seen since before the factory closure that had started our financial struggles. When he woke up, the first thing he did was reach for my hand to look at his mother's ring on my finger. "Still there," he murmured with a sleepy smile. I was half convinced I dreamed the whole thing. "Very much real," I assured him, admiring how the morning sun made the diamonds sparkle. "So what's the first thing you want to do as a newly wealthy man?" "Call in sick to work and take my wife out for breakfast at a place that doesn't have a dollar menu," he said immediately, then paused. "Actually, can I do that? Just not show up?" I laughed at his uncertainty. "David, you could buy the community center and give yourself a raise. I think you can take a personal day." The restaurant David chose was a small bistro downtown that we'd walked past countless times but never entered because their prices were beyond our budget. The hostess seated us at a table by the window, and David ordered without looking at the right side of the menu for the first time in our marriage. "This is weird," he said, cutting into eggs Benedict that cost more than we used to spend on groceries in a day. "I keep waiting for someone to tell me there's been a mistake." "There's no mistake. Margaret showed us the documentation. You saw the trust fund papers." "I know, but..." He gestured around the restaurant. Yesterday, spending $25 on breakfast would have meant we couldn't afford lunch. Today, I could buy this entire building and it wouldn't make a dent in my bank account. How do people adjust to that kind of change? I guess we'll figure it out together. After breakfast, we drove to the community center so David could explain to his supervisor that he needed a few days off to handle family matters. I waited in the car, watching through the windows as David talked to the kids who were already there for Saturday morning programs. Even from a distance, I could see how they lit up when they saw him, crowding around him like puppies competing for attention. A knock on my car window made me jump. Maria, the little girl whose shoes David had bought, was standing outside with a gap-toothed grin. "Mrs. Chen, are you coming in today?" I rolled down the window. "Not today, sweetie. Mr. David and I have some family things to take care of. Is everything okay?" Mr. David looked different today. Happy different. Kids notice everything, I thought. Everything's very okay. Mr. David got some good news about his family. He found his family? Maria's eyes went wide. That's so cool. He told us once that he didn't have any family except you. Now he has more? He sure does. Maria bounced on her toes excitedly. I can't wait to tell him that I'm happy for him. Mr. David deserves to have lots of family because he's the nicest person ever. When David returned to the car 20 minutes later, his eyes were suspiciously bright. What's wrong? I asked immediately. Nothing's wrong, He took a shaky breath. I told them I needed a few days off, and Marcus, you remember Marcus, the teenager who was in that fight, he asked if everything was okay with my family. And I gotta say, yes, everything's perfect with my family, for the first time in my entire life. I reached over and squeezed his hand. So, what's the plan for today? Margaret wants to take us to meet with her financial advisor and lawyer. Apparently, there are some papers I need to sign to officially access the trust fund, and she wants to make sure I understand everything before I make any decisions. The offices of Whitfield and Associates occupied an entire floor of one of the city's most prestigious downtown buildings. The elevator that took us to the 32nd floor was probably worth more than our annual rent. Everything about the place screamed old money and established power. From the Persian rugs to the oil paintings to the receptionist who somehow managed to look both welcoming and intimidatingly polished, Margaret was waiting for us in a conference room with two other people. A distinguished man in his 60s who introduced himself as James Whitfield, Margaret's lawyer and the senior partner of the firm, and a woman named Sarah Chen, no relation despite the name, who had been managing David's trust fund for the past decade. David, James said, shaking his hand firmly, your grandmother has told me so much about you. I have to say, I'm impressed by what you've accomplished without any of the advantages your inheritance could have provided. I'm not sure I've accomplished much, David replied modestly. Are you kidding? Sarah interjected, looking up from a thick file. I've been following your work at the Riverside Community Center as part of my research into your character and interests. The programs you've developed have reduced juvenile crime rates in that neighborhood by 30% over 3 years. The college preparation initiative you started has helped 47 kids get accepted to universities. Those are remarkable accomplishments for someone working with essentially no budget. David looked stunned. You've been researching me? For the past 2 weeks, ever since your grandmother asked me to investigate whether you were really her missing grandson. Sarah explained. Part of my job is to make sure trust fund beneficiaries are who they claim to be, and that they're likely to use inherited wealth responsibly. Based on everything I've learned about you, I can confidently say you're going to be one of the most thoughtful inheritors I've ever worked with. For the next 2 hours, they walked David through the specifics of his inheritance. The trust fund itself had grown from the original $3 million his parents had left to over $12 million through careful investment over 20 years. But that was only part of the story. Your father owned a 30% stake in Chen Textiles, which was founded by your great-grandfather, James explained. The company has thrived over the past 2 decades and is now worth approximately $40 million. Your stake in the company generates about $2 million in passive income annually. David's hand found mine under the table and squeezed so tightly I thought he might break my fingers. Then there's the real estate portfolio, Sarah continued. Your parents owned several properties that have been maintained and managed by our firm. There's the family estate in Connecticut, a vacation home in the Hamptons, a condo in Manhattan, and several rental properties. Combined value is approximately $8 million. So the total inheritance is, David's voice came out as barely a whisper, approximately $20 million in assets, plus the ongoing income from your business stake, James said matter-of-factly. And, of course, all of this has been accumulating value for 20 years while we've been searching for you. I felt dizzy. $20 million? My husband was worth $20 million. Now, Margaret said gently, I want you to know that none of this comes with strings attached. This money is yours to do with whatever you think is best. If you want to continue working at the community center, wonderful. If you want to travel the world, that's fine too. If you want to give it all away to charity, that's your choice to make. But, Sarah added with a smile, I'd be happy to help you explore options for maximizing the social impact of your wealth, if that interests you. Based on your work history, I suspect it might. David was quiet for a long time, processing everything. Finally, he looked at me. What do you think? I think, I said carefully, that this gives us the freedom to do whatever makes us happiest. You love working with kids. Now you can do that without worrying about paying rent. I want to expand the programs at Riverside, David said suddenly, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. I want to hire more counselors, offer college scholarships, maybe even provide housing assistance for families who need it. And I want to replicate what we're doing in other communities. The Chen Foundation, Margaret said with a knowing smile. I had a feeling that's where your mind would go. You could fund community centers in every major city in the country, Sarah said excitedly. You could create a nationwide network of youth programs, all operating under the same principles that have made Riverside so successful. For the first time since we'd sat down, David looked truly excited rather than overwhelmed. Could we really do that? David, with $20 million and $2 million in annual income, you could do that and barely touch your principal investment. James assured him, you could run a foundation that size indefinitely. By the time we left the law office, David had signed papers officially claiming his inheritance and had scheduled follow-up meetings to begin establishing his foundation. We walked out of that building as genuinely wealthy people, with David's mother's ring on my finger and a certified check for $1 million in David's pocket as immediate access to his trust fund. I need to call work, David said as we stood on the sidewalk outside the building. I need to tell them I won't be in Monday either. Are you going to quit? Eventually, but not yet. I want to make sure the transition is smooth for the kids. And honestly, I want to keep working there until we get the foundation set up and running. Those kids need consistency. I loved him more in that moment than I ever had before. Most people, suddenly finding themselves worth $20 million, would be making plans to quit their jobs immediately. David was worried about disappointing a group of at-risk teenagers. There's something else I want to do today, David said, pulling out his phone. I want to call your parents. My stomach lurched. Are you sure you're ready for that conversation? I'm ready to watch your father's face when he realizes his daughter married up instead of down. We decided to drive over to my parents'house unannounced. It was a risky move, but David insisted he wanted to see Dad's reaction in person. The drive across town felt longer than usual, probably because we were both rehearsing the conversation in our heads. What if he doesn't believe us? I asked as we pulled into their driveway. Then we'll show him the documentation. Sarah gave us copies of everything. What if he thinks we're lying or delusional? Then we'll invite him to call James Whitfield and verify everything. What if? Ashley. David turned off the car and took my hands. Your father spent 3 years telling me I wasn't good enough for you. Today, I get to prove him wrong. I've been looking forward to this conversation since we left Margaret's lawyer's office. Mom answered the door, looking surprised to see us on a Saturday afternoon without prior notice. Ashley! David! What a nice surprise. Come in, come in. Your father's in the living room watching the game. We followed her inside, where Dad was indeed planted in his favorite recliner with a beer and the remote control. He looked up when we entered, his expression shifting from mild surprise to resignation. probably expecting another uncomfortable conversation about our financial struggles. "Robert, look who's here," Mom announced cheerfully. "I can see that." Dad muted the television and turned to face us. "Everything okay? You both look different today." "We have some news to share," David said, his voice steady but with an undercurrent of excitement that only I could detect. "Good news, I hope," Mom said, settling onto the couch. "We could use some good news around here." "It's very good news," I said, unable to keep the smile off my face any longer. David found his family. Dad's eyebrows went up slightly, the first sign of genuine interest he'd shown in David in months. "Found your family? What do you mean?" "It turns out I wasn't as alone in the world as I thought," David said. "My grandmother has been searching for me for 15 years. We met her yesterday." "That's wonderful, dear," Mom said warmly. "Tell us about her." For the next 10 minutes, David shared the story of Margaret's search, the bureaucratic failures that had separated them, and their emotional reunion. Both of my parents listened intently, and I could see Dad's expression softening as he began to understand the magnitude of what David had been through as a child. "So you have family after all," Dad said when David finished. "That must be quite an adjustment." "It is," David agreed. "But there's more." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the folder of documents Sarah had given him. "It turns out my parents left me an inheritance that's been sitting in a trust fund for 20 years. Dad leaned forward slightly, his businessman instincts engaging. "What kind of inheritance?" "The kind that makes your concerns about my ability to provide for Ashley somewhat irrelevant," David said with a slight smile. I watched my father's face carefully as David explained about the trust fund, the business stake, and the real estate portfolio. Dad's expression went through several distinct phases: skepticism, surprise, shock, and finally, something that looked like embarrassment. $20 million? Dad repeated when David finished. "Give or take," David confirmed, handing over the documentation. "These are certified copies of the trust fund documents if you'd like to verify." Dad took the papers with hands that weren't quite steady, scanning them with the eye of someone who'd spent decades reading financial documents. After several minutes of silence, he looked up at David with an expression I'd never seen before. "Son," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology." "You don't owe me anything, Mr. Harrison." "Yes, I do." Dad set the papers aside and looked directly at David. "I judged you based on your paycheck instead of your character. I questioned your ability to take care of my daughter when you've been taking care of an entire community of children with practically no resources. I was wrong and I'm sorry." "You were trying to protect Ashley," David said graciously. "I understand that." "I was being a snob," Dad corrected. "I was so focused on money and status that I couldn't see what kind of man you really are. Any fool can inherit wealth, but it takes real character to do what you've done with nothing." Mom was wiping tears from her eyes. "David, honey, we're so happy for you. Both of you. You deserve all the happiness in the world." "There's one more thing," I said, unable to resist. I held out my left hand, showing off the engagement ring David had given me at the cafe. "Oh my goodness!" Mom gasped. "Ashley, it's gorgeous!" "It was David's mother's ring," I explained. "He proposed again yesterday, properly this time, with family watching." Dad stood up abruptly and walked over to David, who tensed slightly, probably expecting another lecture. Instead, Dad pulled him into an awkward but sincere hug. "Welcome to the family, son," he said gruffly. "Really welcome this time." The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of phone calls and excited planning. Mom called Emma, who screamed so loudly over the phone that we could hear her from across the room. Dad called his brother to share the news, and I could hear the pride in his voice as he bragged about his wealthy son-in-law. "I have to ask," Dad said during a quieter moment, "what are you planning to do with all that money?" "Start a foundation," David answered immediately. "I want to create community centers across the country, places where kids like I used to be can get the support they need." Dad nodded approvingly. "That's exactly what I'd expect you to do." You're gonna help a lot of children, son. As we were getting ready to leave, Dad pulled me aside. Ashley, I want you to know how proud I am of you. Proud of me? Why? Because you saw something in David that I was too stubborn to see. You married a good man, sweetheart. The money is nice, but that's not what makes him worthy of you. His heart is what makes him worthy of you. Driving home, I felt like I was floating. The day had exceeded my wildest expectations. Not only had David's financial status been vindicated, but my father had actually apologized and welcomed him into the family with genuine warmth. So, David said as we pulled into our apartment complex parking lot, "How does it feel to be right about everything?" "Pretty great, actually," I admitted, though I have to say I didn't see the $20 million plot twist coming. Neither did I. This morning I was worried about paying our medical bills. Tonight I'm thinking about buying the hospital. We climbed the stairs to our apartment, the same stairs we'd climbed thousands of times before, but everything felt different now. The narrow hallway seemed charming instead of cramped. The thin walls seemed cozy instead of inadequate. "David?" I said as he unlocked our door. "Yeah." "I know you want to help kids and change the world with your foundation, and I think that's amazing. But can we also do something completely frivolous and fun with some of the money?" He grinned at me over his shoulder. "What did you have in mind?" "I want to take that honeymoon we never had. Somewhere ridiculously expensive and romantic, where we can order room service without looking at the prices and swim in infinity pools that overlook the ocean." "Mrs. Chen," David said, sweeping me into his arms right there in our doorway, "I think that can be arranged." As he carried me across the threshold of our tiny apartment, I thought about how much our lives had changed in just 24 hours. Yesterday, we'd been a struggling young couple, burdened by debt and family disapproval. Today, we were wealthy beyond our dreams, with unlimited possibilities stretched out before us. But the most important thing hadn't changed at all. I was still married to the same kind, generous, wonderful man who'd stolen my heart at a literacy program 5 years ago. The man who bought shoes for children who needed them, who volunteered his time to make the world better, who loved me completely despite my father's criticism and our financial struggles. The money was nice, but David was still the real treasure. And tomorrow, when we started planning our new life together, I'd make sure he never forgot that. The next few weeks flew by in a whirlwind of meetings, paperwork, and life-changing decisions. David threw himself into learning about wealth management with the same intensity he'd once brought to developing youth programs on a shoestring budget. Every morning, he'd wake up early to read financial reports and foundation guidelines, his coffee growing cold as he absorbed information about investment strategies and charitable giving structures. Margaret had insisted we move out of our tiny apartment immediately, offering us the guest house on her Connecticut estate while we figured out our permanent living situation. The guest house, as it turned out, was larger than any home I'd ever imagined living in. It had 4 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms, a gourmet kitchen, and floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked meticulously maintained gardens and a private lake. "This is surreal," I told David on our first morning there, standing in the marble bathroom that was bigger than our entire old apartment. "I keep waiting to wake up back in our old place with the leaky faucet and the radiator that sounds like a freight train." "I know what you mean," David said, adjusting his tie in the mirror. He was getting dressed for another meeting with the lawyers and accountants who were helping him establish the Chen Foundation. Yesterday I caught myself checking price tags at the grocery store out of habit, then remembering that I could probably buy the entire store if I wanted to. The transformation in David over those weeks was remarkable to watch. The constant low-level stress that had shadowed his features for years began to fade, replaced by an energy and confidence I'd never seen before. He still got up early, but now it was to review proposals from architects who were designing the foundation's first community center, or to interview potential staff members who would help him expand his programs nationally. The most significant change came when he finally gave his notice at the Riverside Community Center. He'd agonized over the decision for days, worried about abandoning the kids who depended on him. But when he explained to his supervisor that he was starting a foundation that would not only continue funding Riverside, but would also create similar centers across the country, the conversation took an unexpected turn. David, his supervisor had said, "I've been watching you work miracles with these kids for 3 years, always wishing we had the resources to let you do more. If you're telling me you now have unlimited resources, then I think you have an obligation to think bigger than just one neighborhood." The kids took the news better than expected, especially when David explained that the new foundation would be hiring many of the Riverside staff at significantly higher salaries, and that the center itself would be getting a complete renovation and expansion. "So you're not really leaving?" Maria had said, her gap-toothed grin bright with understanding. "You're just getting superpowers so you can help more kids like us." "Something like that." David had laughed, ruffling her hair affectionately. While David focused on the foundation, I found myself in the strange position of having no job and unlimited resources to do whatever I wanted with my time. At first, the freedom was intoxicating. I slept in, took long baths, read books I'd been meaning to get to for years. But after a few weeks, the novelty wore off and I started feeling restless. "I need something to do," I told Margaret over lunch one afternoon. She'd become not just David's grandmother, but a genuine friend to me, someone whose wisdom and experience I'd come to value enormously. "What did you study in college, dear?" she asked, sipping her tea in the sunroom of her main house. "Business administration with a focus on marketing. But I feel like I want to do something more meaningful now. Something that matters." Margaret smiled knowingly. "You know, the foundation is going to need someone to handle marketing and public relations. David's brilliant with program development, but he'll need help getting the word out about what he's doing." The idea clicked immediately. I could use my business background to help David's foundation reach more communities, secure partnerships with other organizations, and build public support for youth programs. It would be meaningful work that played to my strengths, while letting us work together toward the same goal. "Do you think David would be open to that?" I asked. "I think David would be thrilled to have someone he trusts completely handling that side of the organization." That evening, I pitched the idea to David over dinner at a restaurant that would have bankrupted us a month ago. His face lit up as I described how we could create a national awareness campaign, develop corporate partnerships, and use social media to showcase the impact of community programs on at-risk youth. "Ashley, that's perfect," he said, reaching across the table to take my hand. "I've been worried about how to handle all the publicity side of things. Having you there would make everything so much better." "So we'd be business partners as well as life partners? The best kind of team," he agreed, then paused with a mischievous grin. "Though I should probably warn you, I'm thinking of making the foundation's co-founder position a paid one. Very well paid, in fact." I laughed. "I think I can live with that arrangement." Plans for our first community center were moving forward rapidly. David had chosen a location in Detroit, a neighborhood with demographics similar to the ones surrounding Riverside, but with even fewer resources. The architect's renderings showed a beautiful, modern building with spaces for tutoring, mentorship programs, sports activities, arts classes, and college preparation workshops. "It's going to be incredible," David said, spreading the blueprints across Margaret's dining room table. "We'll be able to serve 3 times as many kids as Riverside, with programs we could never afford before." "What's this space here?" I asked, pointing to a large room near the entrance. "Community meeting space. I want these centers to be resources for entire families, not just kids. We'll offer financial literacy classes for parents, job training programs, health and wellness seminars. The idea is to strengthen whole communities, not just individual children." Margaret, who had been quietly observing our planning sessions, spoke up. "Your parents would be so proud of what you're doing, David. They always believed in using privilege to help others." "Tell me more about them," David said, looking up from the blueprints. "I want to understand what kind of people they were." For the next hour, Margaret shared stories about David's parents that painted a picture of genuinely good people who had used their wealth responsibly. His father had funded scholarship programs at local colleges, while his mother had volunteered at homeless shelters and women's crisis centers. They met at a charity fundraiser, actually. Margaret said with a fond smile. Your father was there because his company was a sponsor, and your mother was there because she was volunteering to help organize the event. He said later that he fell in love with her because she was the only person at the party who seemed more interested in the cause than in networking. Sounds familiar, I said, glancing at David, who had always been more focused on helping people than advancing his career. The apple doesn't fall far from the tree, Margaret agreed. Though I have to say, I think you two are going to accomplish even more than they did. They had good hearts, but you have their resources, plus your own experience with struggle. That combination is going to be powerful. As autumn turned to winter, our new life began to feel more natural and less like an impossible dream. David's confidence as a foundation leader grew daily, and I found genuine fulfillment in developing marketing strategies for our programs. We moved into a beautiful colonial house in an upscale neighborhood, close enough to Margaret that we could visit regularly but far enough away to have our own space. The house was a compromise between David's modest instincts and our new financial reality. It was certainly more luxurious than anything we'd lived in before, with 5 bedrooms, a home office for each of us, and a backyard that backed up to a nature preserve. But it wasn't ostentatious, and David had insisted on choosing something that wouldn't make him uncomfortable when kids from the community centers came to visit. I don't want any child who walks into this house to feel like they're in a different world, he explained to the real estate agent. I want them to see that success is possible without losing touch with where you came from. My relationship with my parents had transformed completely. Dad, who had spent years questioning David's worth, now called him regularly to ask for business advice and proudly introduced him as my son-in-law the philanthropist at every opportunity. Mom had embraced her role as grandmother-in-waiting, constantly hinting about when we might give her grandchildren to spoil. You know, Dad said during one of our weekly family dinners, I've been thinking about what you're doing with the foundation, and I'd like to contribute. Dad, you don't need to do that. I protested, but he held up a hand. I want to. Harrison Construction has had a good year, and I think it's time I started thinking about giving back to the community. I'd like to offer our services for any construction or renovation projects the foundation needs, at cost. David was visibly moved. Mr. Harrison, that's incredibly generous. It's Robert's son, and it's the least I can do after the way I treated you. Besides, I've seen the plans for that Detroit center. It's exactly the kind of project I got into construction to build. Emma, home for winter break from college, had been watching this exchange with obvious delight. I still can't believe how wrong you were about David, Dad. Like, spectacularly wrong. Emma, I warned, but Dad just laughed. She's right. I was spectacularly wrong. But I'm man enough to admit it, and I'm grateful that David's forgiving enough to let me make up for it. The first Chen Foundation Community Center held its grand opening on a frigid February morning in Detroit. Despite the cold, hundreds of people from the neighborhood showed up, along with local politicians, business leaders, and reporters from 3 different news stations. I stood in the crowd, watching David cut the ribbon alongside a group of teenagers who would be among the center's first program participants. He looked confident and comfortable, no trace of the uncertain man who used to worry about whether we could afford groceries. Ladies and gentlemen, he said into the microphone after the ribbon was cut, this building represents more than just a community center. It represents hope. It represents the belief that every child, regardless of their circumstances, deserves the chance to reach their full potential. The crowd erupted in applause, and I felt tears of pride spring to my eyes. This was the man my father had dismissed as inadequate. This was the man who was now changing lives on a scale we could never have imagined. After the ceremony, as we mingled with community members and toured the new facilities, I overheard a conversation between 2 local mothers that made my heart swell. My son Marcus has been talking about Mr. Chen non-stop since he heard about this place opening, one woman said to the other. He keeps saying he wants to be just like him when he grows up. What does Mr. Chen do? The second woman asked. He helps kids who don't have much, just like he didn't have much when he was young. But look at him now. He's proof that where you start doesn't have to be where you end up. That evening, back in our hotel room, David and I sat by the window looking out at the lights of Detroit. The opening had been a complete success. with over 100 kids already signed up for programs that wouldn't begin until the following week. "You know what the best part of today was?" David asked, loosening his tie. "What?" "When that little boy asked me if I used to be poor like him, and I could tell him yes, and then show him that things can get better. Not because of money, but because of hard work and people who believe in you." I curled up next to him on the hotel room's love seat. "Is that what you told him?" I told him that I used to worry about having enough food to eat and not having anyone to help me with homework. And then I told him that now I get to make sure other kids don't have to worry about those things. I told him that sometimes the best helpers are people who understand what it feels like to need help. What did he say to that? David smiled. He asked if he could help other kids someday too. I told him that if he works hard and stays focused, he absolutely can. As we prepared for bed that night, I thought about how much our lives had changed in less than a year. We'd gone from struggling to pay bills to opening multi-million-dollar community centers. I'd gone from defending my husband against my father's criticism to watching that same father beam with pride as David gave interviews to national news outlets. But the most important thing hadn't changed at all. David was still the same man who cared more about helping others than helping himself. He still put children's needs before his own comfort. He still looked at me like I was the most amazing woman in the world, even though he was now wealthy and accomplished enough to have his pick of partners. "Ashley?" he said quietly as we settled into bed. Do you ever think about what would have happened if Margaret had never found me? If we just kept struggling along like we were?" I considered the question seriously. I think we would have been okay. Scared and stressed and tired, but okay. We would have figured it out together eventually. But would you have been happy? Really happy long term? David, I was already happy. The money made things easier. But it didn't make me love you more. It just gave us the freedom to do more good in the world. He was quiet for a moment, then said, "I love you for saying that. But I have to admit, I sleep better now knowing that if you get sick, we can afford the best doctors. I feel more confident as a husband knowing I can actually provide for our future children. The money didn't make me worthy of you, but it made me feel worthy of you." "You were always worthy of me," I said firmly, "but I'm glad you feel that way now." As I drifted off to sleep that night, I thought about my father's words from so many months ago, his insistence that David couldn't provide properly for me. He'd been wrong about David's financial capacity, but he'd been even more wrong about what provision really meant. David had always provided for me in the ways that truly mattered. He'd provided love, support, laughter, and partnership. He'd provided a sense of purpose and meaning in life. The trust fund and business inheritance had simply given him the tools to provide those same things for thousands of other people. Tomorrow, we'd fly back home and start planning the second Chen Foundation Community Center. We'd hire more staff, develop new programs, and continue building something that would outlast both of us. We'd use our wealth not just to solve our own problems, but to solve problems for entire communities. And at the end of each day, regardless of how many lives we'd touched or how much good we'd accomplished, I'd still go to bed next to the same man who'd stolen my heart when he had nothing to offer but love. The man my father had once thought wasn't good enough for me, who had turned out to be better than any of us had ever imagined possible. 5 years later, I stood in the ballroom of the Ritz-Carlton, watching my husband address a crowd of over 500 philanthropists, business leaders, and community activists at the annual Chen Foundation Gala. The event had become one of the most prestigious charity fundraisers in the country, but tonight felt especially significant. "Tonight, we celebrate a milestone," David said into the microphone, his voice carrying the confidence that had grown with each passing year. "The Chen Foundation has now opened its 50th community center, serving over 25,000 children and families across the nation." The applause was thunderous, but I barely heard it. I was too busy watching my father, who sat at the head table with tears streaming down his cheeks, clapping harder than anyone else in the room. The same man who had once questioned whether David could provide for one woman was now watching him provide hope for thousands of families. Next to Dad sat Margaret, elegant in navy blue silk, her eyes bright with pride as she watched her grandson receive a standing ovation. She'd become the grandmother I'd never had, offering wisdom and support as David and I navigated the complexities of sudden wealth and public attention. The impact of these centers extends far beyond the numbers, David continued. Yesterday, I received a call from Maria Rodriguez, one of the first children I worked with at the Riverside Center 8 years ago. She's now a sophomore at Stanford University, studying social work because she wants to give back to her community the way others gave back to her. I smiled, thinking of little Maria with her gap-toothed grin and boundless enthusiasm. She'd kept in touch with David throughout high school, sending photos of her graduation, her college acceptance letter, and her first week of classes. Seeing her succeed had reinforced David's belief that every child deserved the same opportunities, regardless of their starting circumstances. But tonight isn't just about celebrating our achievements, David said, his tone becoming more personal. It's about acknowledging the people who made this work possible. None of us accomplishes anything meaningful alone. His eyes found mine across the crowded ballroom, and he smiled the same smile that had made me fall in love with him all those years ago at the literacy program. My wife Ashley has been my partner in every sense of the word, building this foundation from a dream into a reality. My grandmother Margaret found me when I thought I was alone in the world, and gave me back my family. My father-in-law Robert taught me that it's never too late to admit when you're wrong and start fresh. Dad wiped his eyes with his napkin, overwhelmed by the public acknowledgement from the man he'd once dismissed. And the children and families we serve continue to teach me every day that resilience, hope, and community support can overcome any obstacle. After David's speech, the formal part of the evening wound down into cocktails and conversation. I found myself talking with the mayor of Chicago, who was hoping to bring a Chen Foundation Center to her city, when I felt a familiar hand on my lower back. "How are you feeling?" David asked quietly, his eyes full of concern and excitement. I placed my hand over my still flat stomach, where our first child was growing. We'd found out about the pregnancy just 2 weeks ago, and hadn't told anyone yet except Margaret, who had burst into tears of joy and immediately begun planning a nursery. "Good, tired, but good," I whispered back. "Are you ready to make the announcement?" "Are you?" I looked around the ballroom, at all the people whose lives had been touched by David's work. Community leaders who'd seen their neighborhoods transformed, donors who'd found purpose in supporting youth programs, former program participants who'd gone on to college and careers, and were now giving back to the next generation. "I'm ready." David returned to the microphone, waiting for the room to quiet down. "Before we close tonight, Ashley and I have one more piece of news to share. Next fall, the Chen Foundation will be welcoming its youngest member. We're expecting our first child." The room erupted again, this time with a warmth that felt distinctly personal, rather than professional. These weren't just donors and colleagues anymore, they'd become an extended family united by shared purpose. Dad reached us first, pulling both of us into a fierce hug. "I'm going to be a grandfather," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "That baby is going to be so lucky to have you two as parents." "Robert," David said, gripping my father's hand firmly, "I want you to know that this child is going to grow up hearing stories about their grandfather who built homes for families, and who taught their parents the importance of admitting when you're wrong and making things right." Mom appeared next, already planning baby showers and nursery themes, followed by Emma, who screamed with excitement just like she had when we'd first announced David's inheritance years ago. As the evening wound down and the last guest departed, David and I stood alone in the empty ballroom, still in our formal clothes but finally able to breathe freely. "Can you believe this is our life?" I asked, leaning against him as we looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the city lights below. "Some days I still can't," he admitted. "This morning I woke up in a mansion, went to a board meeting where we approved funding for 3 new community centers, and tonight I announced that I'm going to be a father to a room full of people who consider our family's happiness newsworthy. Any regrets?" "Only one." David turned to face me, his expression suddenly serious. "I regret that it took me so long to feel like I deserved this life, deserved you. I wasted too much time believing your father's criticism instead of trusting your judgment. Dad was wrong about a lot of things, but he was protecting his daughter the only way he knew how. And honestly, his disapproval taught us both something important about not letting other people define our worth. David nodded thoughtfully. The kids we work with now, a lot of them are getting the same messages I used to get. That they're not good enough. That they'll never amount to anything. I want them to see that those voices are wrong. They will. You're living proof that circumstances don't determine destiny. 6 months later, our daughter Emma Rose Chen was born on a sunny spring morning, surrounded by more love than any child could possibly need. Dad, who had once worried that David couldn't provide for his family, spent hours holding his granddaughter and telling anyone who would listen about her father's latest foundation initiatives. Margaret, now officially great-grandmother, moved into our guest house so she could help with the baby and continue to be part of our daily lives. She'd found her lost grandson, gained a granddaughter-in-law, and now had a great-granddaughter to spoil completely. David proved to be exactly the father I'd always known he would be, patient, gentle, and completely devoted to our daughter's well-being. Between foundation meetings and site visits to new community centers, he could be found singing lullabies, reading board books, and explaining to Emma Rose how she was going to help change the world someday. She's going to grow up thinking everyone has the resources to help others, I told him one evening as we watched Emma Rose sleep in her crib. Good, David said firmly. Let her think that's normal. Let her expect that from herself and everyone around her. The world needs more people who believe helping others is just what you do. Looking back now, I realized that my father's harsh judgment had inadvertently given us something valuable. It had forced us to examine our own values, to decide what really mattered in a marriage and a life together. When David's wealth was revealed, it didn't change who he was or who we were as a couple. It simply gave us bigger tools to build the life we'd always wanted. The man Dad had said wasn't good enough for me had turned out to be more than good enough for thousands of children who needed someone to believe in them. And every night, as I watch him rock our daughter to sleep while humming the lullaby his own mother once sang to him, I'm reminded that love really was enough all along. Everything else was just extra. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.